as a way of preparing the ground for something. Actually, although one's first response is to laugh about the kind of story that the Global Times has published today. It's kind of amateurish and ridiculous. But I think there's a far more sinister message that is being sent by this article in the Global Times, referring to Chinese sources providing this information about a deep network of Australian espionage in China. But I think the kind of critical passage in this story in the Global Times, which is a mouthpiece for the Chinese Communist Party, is one where it writes, in response to Australia's espionage offensive, Chinese counter-espionage agencies will take more vigorous countermeasures to crack down on Australian espionage operations. So I think that might foreshadow something really quite nasty about to happen. Well, one has to think of the two Michaels, in Canada, the former diplomat and the senior businessman who, after the arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou, were arrested in China on trumped-up charges and have been rotting in China's jails ever since. And so I think there's a real possibility that some Australians might be targeted. I'm quite worried about that, hitting back against the action by ASIO and the AFP last Friday when they raided the home of Shavkat Mosulman, and in particular, and I think more interestingly, his part-time staffer, John Zhang, who is very clearly a prominent or very active United Front operative in Australia, who may also be involved in some kind of spying activity. Well, I think all we can do is to put up defences to protect our democratic institutions, to influence and infiltration, obviously, take measures to limit and respond to espionage activity in our country. I think it's very important politically to draw a clear line that Australian values are at stake, and we're not going to be bullied, and to say that in a always calm but firm way, which is what the Morrison government is doing, and then otherwise hope that there's a change of attitude in Beijing, because ultimately this all emanates from Beijing's increasingly aggressive attitude towards Australia. And China is being quite clearly an aggressive actor in many ways around the world. The China-India border is an instance of that, the wolf warrior diplomacy, which has alienated so many people in the United Kingdom and France, for example. But also, perhaps the closest parallel for Australia is what has been happening in Canada over the last 18 months, where there has been a really sustained campaign by Beijing to punish Canada for the arrest of the Huawei executives with trade sanctions, with violent language, with the arrest of Canadians on trumped-up charges, with an intensification of influence activity. And that's also what we've been seeing in Australia. And it has to be said that in the Canadian case, the government's been quite weak, but it has not capitulated and handed over the Huawei executive. And it's difficult to see how that campaign might end.
At least 53 people have been arrested after demonstrations in Hong Kong against China's planned national security legislation for the territory. A silent protest against the law began in the Kowloon district before police and demonstrators clashed. The event came a day after Hong Kong police refused permission for an annual march to go ahead to mark the territory's handover to China. China's proposed security legislation would make it a crime to undermine Beijing's authority in Hong Kong and could also see China installing its own security agencies in the territory for the first time. A clinical advisor to the British government has predicted a second wave of coronavirus will hit the UK in winter. The warning comes as the government considers imposing a local lockdown on the city of Leicester after a spike in infections there.
Leicester City, home to hundreds of thousands of people, a large, diverse community, enjoying the freedoms brought about by the government's increasing easing of lockdown restrictions. But now the government's considering tougher restrictions in the city to prevent new infections. That's because in the first 2 weeks of June, there was a surge of new cases, 658 in total. That's around a quarter of all cases in the city during this pandemic. The Labour MP for Leicester East says at least 5 schools and a supermarket have already been closed down after staff there tested positive.
I don't think we should take that risk. I think we should put lives first, and therefore I believe absolutely that we need to protect the residents, protect lives, and we need to install a local lockdown if that's what it means.
The local authorities requested help to increase the numbers of people being tested for the virus. This vital for getting the outbreak under control. The government's also promising other assistance.
There will be support going into Leicester, and in fact the Health Secretary was in touch with many of us over the weekend, explaining some of the measures, the support on testing, resources that are going to the local authority as well.
In this city, some believe it's too early to talk about having a lockdown without pinning down exactly where the problem lies.
After many weeks of asking, we now have that data. We are analysing it over this weekend, and hopefully early next week we'll know whether we've got a problem, and if we have, where it is.
The discussion about what happens in Leicester could be a foretaste of what may happen with increasing frequency across the country as the government continues to lift the lockdown. Pubs and restaurants in England are due to open next weekend.
The next 3 months are absolutely critical. The numbers are lower, but the virus hasn't changed. And come the winter, come the reopening of schools, which is absolutely critical, we can anticipate to see rebounds and second waves.
In a statement, the Department of Health said it was supporting the council and local partners in Leicester to help prevent further transmission of the virus, and this included providing thousands of home testing kits.
The US president's claim that he wasn't briefed on intelligence that Russia paid Taliban-linked militants to kill American troops has been met with scepticism. A story in the New York Times alleges a Russian military unit offered cash rewards for successful attacks last year on US and coalition soldiers in Afghanistan. Donald Trump tweeted that he and his close aides were not briefed on any such intelligence, a move described as unusual by Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton.
I've never recalled a circumstance where the president himself goes out of his way to say he wasn't briefed on something.
Russia's foreign ministry has dismissed the report. Boeing looks set to begin test flights of its grounded 737 MAX aircraft as early as today, after the US Federal Aviation Administration gave its permission. The plane was removed from service 15 months ago after 2 crashes that killed 346 people. The Reuters news agency is reporting that the certification test will last 3 days and see pilots intentionally triggering the stall prevention software that was blamed for the crashes. Despite giving the go-ahead for tests, the FAA says it's not made a decision on whether to allow these 737 MAX's return to service. The coronavirus pandemic has seen many of the world's airlines grounded, with the crisis especially acute close to home. Qantas has shed thousands of jobs to keep its head above water, while Virgin has now finally landed a potential saviour. Tonight's Four Corners takes a closer look at the battle to keep the country's second carrier in the skies.
COVID-19 has thrown economies into recession and overturned modern assumptions about the ease of and access to travel.
We had 9,000 passengers a day coming through, and now we're lucky if we get a dozen. It couldn't have fallen off more or more quickly. You know, we've had flights with more dogs on them than passengers in the last couple of weeks.
Nothing like this has happened before in the airline industry. The impact has been dramatic, it's been vicious.
Around the world, airlines were pushed to the brink. And here in Australia, Virgin became the first big corporate casualty.
The magnitude of the problem just fell on us. The skies were effectively closed. So you have a big capital-intensive industry with a lot of people and you have no revenue. Our revenue went down to a very, very low number very, very quickly.
The future of flying is now in question.
Initially, people are going to be much more nervous about flying. I think domestically we'll probably find in Australia, if we can keep clean, as it were, that people will get a lot more relaxed fairly quickly. Internationally, it'll be a different thing.
And you can catch the full episode of Four Corners tonight at 8:30 on ABC TV and on iView. There have been changes to the